The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, yet couldn't avoid. Sarah Kelly sat on the edge of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at Megan Diaz, who had just whispered the confession that changed everything. The moonlight streaming through the curtains cast silver shadows across Megan's face, highlighting the vulnerability in her dark eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to take back what she'd just said but couldn't find the courage to do so. "I've been in love with you for 2 years," Megan had said, her voice barely audible in the quiet of Sarah's bedroom. 2 years and 3 months, actually. I know because I started counting the day you moved in next door and brought me those ridiculous cupcakes with the rainbow sprinkles. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Everything she thought she knew about their friendship suddenly recontextualized in the span of a heartbeat. She could feel the heat radiating from Megan's body where she sat just inches away, could smell the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume mixed with something else, something that spoke of nervous anticipation and desperate hope. "Megan," Sarah whispered, her own voice trembling. "What are you saying?" But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends found themselves on the precipice of something that would either destroy everything they had or transform it into something beautiful beyond imagination, one would have to go back to the beginning. Back to 3 months earlier, when Sarah Kelly first realized that her comfortable life was built on a foundation of lies she'd been telling herself for years. Sarah had always prided herself on being practical. At 28, she had a steady job as a graphic designer, a tidy apartment with plants that somehow managed to stay alive despite her erratic schedule, and a boyfriend of 8 months who checked all the appropriate boxes. Stephen Wright was handsome in a conventional way, with his sandy hair and easy smile. He was reliable, financially stable, and her mother approved of him, which should have been enough. Should have been. The problem was the growing emptiness that had taken root in her chest, a hollow feeling that expanded with each passing day despite Stephen's best efforts to fill it. She'd catch herself staring out her office window during meetings, wondering why she felt like she was sleepwalking through her own life. Why Stephen's kisses felt perfunctory, like checking items off a grocery list. Why she found excuses to avoid his touch, claiming headaches or exhaustion, when really she just felt nothing at all. It was during one of these periods of restless discontent that Megan Diaz had knocked on her door with a plate of homemade cookies and a smile that seemed to light up the entire hallway. Sarah's new neighbor was everything Sarah wasn't, vibrant and spontaneous, with wild curly hair that she wore like a crown and a laugh that made everyone within hearing distance want to smile. She worked as a freelance photographer, which meant her schedule was as unpredictable as her wardrobe, and she had a way of making even the most mundane conversations feel like adventures. "I figured I should introduce myself properly," Megan had said that first evening, holding out the plate with flowers still dusting her fingertips. "I'm Megan, your neighbor from 4B, and I make excellent cookies, but terrible first impressions, so I'm hoping the cookies will compensate for whatever awkward thing I'm about to say." Sarah had found herself laughing before she could stop herself, something that had been happening less and less frequently lately. "I'm Sarah, and I can't imagine you making a terrible first impression." "Oh, you sweet, naive woman," Megan had grinned. "Give me 5 minutes." But 5 minutes had turned into an hour, then 2, then an entire evening spent talking on Sarah's couch while the cookies disappeared between them. Megan had a way of asking questions that made Sarah think, really think, about things she'd never considered before. Not invasive questions, but thoughtful ones that seemed to unlock parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Megan had asked at one point, curled up in the corner of Sarah's couch with her legs tucked beneath her. "Like you're playing a character in a movie, but you can't remember auditioning for the part?" The question had hit Sarah like a physical blow, so accurate it took her breath away. Every day, she'd admitted before she could stop herself. "Yeah," Megan had nodded, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. "Me too." That had been the beginning. The beginning of coffee dates that stretched into lunch dates that became afternoon adventures, evening conversations that lasted until sunrise. Megan had a way of drawing Sarah out of her carefully constructed shell, encouraging her to try new restaurants, visit art galleries, take long walks through parts of the city Sarah had never explored despite living there for 5 years. Stephen had noticed the change, of course. How could he not? Sarah found herself declining his invitations more often, claiming she had plans with her new friend. She started wearing brighter colors, experimenting with her hair, laughing more freely. The changes should have made her happier in their relationship, should have brought more energy to their interactions, but instead they seemed to highlight everything that was missing between them. "You're different," Stephen had said one evening as they sat in their usual restaurant, the one with the predictable menu and the waitstaff who knew their orders by heart. "Since you started spending time with that photographer." "Different how?" Sarah had asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "I don't know. More alive, I guess. But also more distant. From me." His blue eyes had searched her face, looking for answers she didn't know how to give. "Are we okay, Sarah?" The question had lodged itself in her throat like a stone. Were they okay? Had they ever been okay, really, or had she just been so afraid of being alone that she'd convinced herself that comfortable was the same as happy? "I don't know," she'd answered honestly, and the relief of admitting it had been almost overwhelming. They'd had the breakup conversation 2 weeks later, a surprisingly gentle dissolution that felt more like a mutual acknowledgement of something they'd both known for months. Stephen was hurt, but not devastated, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about the depth of what they'd shared. He'd found someone new within a month, and Sarah had felt nothing but genuine happiness for him, which confirmed what she'd suspected all along. She was relieved to be free, but free for what exactly? That question had haunted her through the early weeks of summer, as she and Megan grew closer and Sarah began to notice things about herself that she'd never paid attention to before. The way her pulse quickened when Megan texted her. How she found herself looking forward to their time together with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to simple friendship. The strange flutter in her stomach when Megan laughed at something she'd said, or the way her skin seemed to burn wherever Megan touched her, even casually. It was during one of their regular movie nights that Sarah first allowed herself to acknowledge what was happening to her. They'd been watching some romantic comedy that Megan had chosen, curled up together on Sarah's couch with a bowl of popcorn between them. The female lead was having a crisis about her engagement, questioning whether she was marrying the right person, and Megan had made some comment about how obvious it was that the woman was gay. "How can you tell?" Sarah had asked, genuinely curious. "The way she looks at her maid of honor," Megan had said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Like she's memorizing her face. Like she's afraid she'll never get to see it again. Something in Megan's tone had made Sarah look at her more closely. There was a wistfulness there, a longing that seemed to echo something deep in Sarah's own chest. "Have you ever felt that way about someone?" Megan had gone very still beside her, her dark eyes fixed on the television screen. "Maybe," she'd said quietly. "Have you?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities that Sarah wasn't ready to examine. "I don't know," she'd whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She was beginning to know, actually. Beginning to understand why her relationship with Stephen had felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, why she'd felt like she was acting a part rather than living her life. Beginning to recognize the difference between the love she'd thought she was supposed to feel and the love that was actually growing in her chest like a flower reaching toward sunlight. The realization had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Sarah had spent sleepless nights staring at her ceiling, trying to make sense of feelings that seemed to rewrite everything she'd thought she knew about herself. She was 28 years old and apparently discovering her sexuality for the first time, which felt both impossibly late and perfectly on time. She'd started paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. The way women moved, the sound of feminine laughter, the curve of a shoulder, or the graceful line of a neck. She'd always appreciated beauty in women, but she'd categorized it as aesthetic appreciation, the way one might admire a painting or a sunset. Now she was beginning to understand that there might be more to it than that. And at the center of all this awakening was Megan, beautiful and vibrant and completely unaware of the chaos she was creating in Sarah's carefully ordered world. The summer had passed in a blur of shared experiences and growing intimacy. They developed rituals, inside jokes, a shorthand that spoke to how closely their lives had become intertwined. Megan had a key to Sarah's apartment and used it freely, showing up with coffee and pastries on weekend mornings, letting herself in when Sarah was running late from work. Sarah had started keeping Megan's favorite tea in her kitchen, had learned to recognize her knock, had begun to measure the success of her days by whether she'd made Megan laugh. It was a dangerous kind of closeness, Sarah realized, the kind that made it easy to pretend that what she was feeling was just intense friendship. After all, women had close friendships all the time. Women shared intimate conversations, physical affection, emotional support. There was nothing inherently romantic about any of it, except for the way Sarah's heart raced when Megan smiled at her, or the way she found herself memorizing the sound of Megan's voice. Or the dreams she'd started having that left her awake and aching in the dark hours before dawn. The first crack in her carefully maintained denial had come on a Thursday evening in late July. They'd been cooking dinner together in Sarah's kitchen, some complicated pasta dish that Megan had insisted they try, and Sarah had been watching Megan move around her space with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. Megan had been wearing a sundress, yellow with tiny flowers, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that left the graceful line of her neck exposed. Sarah had been chopping vegetables, trying to focus on the task at hand, when Megan had moved behind her to reach for something in the cabinet. For just a moment, Megan's body had pressed against Sarah's back, her breath warm against Sarah's ear as she murmured an apology for reaching around her. The contact had lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it had sent electricity shooting through Sarah's entire body. She'd frozen, the knife suspended above the cutting board, her entire being focused on the points where Megan's body touched hers. The soft pressure of Megan's chest against her shoulder blades, the brush of Megan's hip against her waist, the whisper of Megan's breath against her neck. When Megan had stepped away, Sarah had felt the loss like a physical ache. "Sorry," Megan had said, completely oblivious to the havoc she'd just wreaked. "I should have asked you to move." "It's fine," Sarah had managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about it was fine. Friends didn't react that way to casual contact. Friends didn't spend the rest of the evening hyper-aware of every brush of fingers, every accidental touch, every moment when the space between them seemed charged with possibility. That night, after Megan had gone home, Sarah had stood in her shower and finally admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for months. She was falling in love with her best friend. Had probably already fallen, if she was being honest. The realization had been both devastating and liberating, like finally naming something that had been growing in the shadows of her consciousness. She was in love with Megan Diaz. The knowledge had changed everything and nothing. Sarah still saw Megan almost daily, still treasured their friendship, still felt that flutter of joy whenever Megan's name appeared on her phone. But now there was an undercurrent of longing that colored every interaction, a constant awareness of what she wanted but couldn't have. Because Megan was straight, as far as Sarah knew. She'd mentioned ex-boyfriends, had pointed out attractive men in restaurants and coffee shops, had never given any indication that she was interested in women romantically. Sarah had no reason to believe that her feelings were anything other than hopelessly one-sided. The thought of losing Megan's friendship by confessing her feelings was unbearable, so Sarah had chosen to suffer in silence, to treasure what she had rather than risk everything for what she wanted. It was a special kind of torture, being so close to someone you loved while knowing that the love could never be returned, but it seemed preferable to the alternative of losing Megan entirely. August had been particularly difficult. The summer heat had meant more time spent in lighter clothing, more casual touches as they sought relief from the humidity, more opportunities for Sarah to torture herself with proximity to what she couldn't have. Megan had developed a habit of linking their arms when they walked, of playing with Sarah's hair when they watched movies, of falling asleep against Sarah's shoulder during lazy Sunday afternoons. Each touch was a gift and a torment, precious and painful in equal measure. It was during one of those lazy Sundays that Sarah had first suspected that maybe, possibly, her feelings weren't as one-sided as she'd assumed. They'd been lying on Sarah's couch, ostensibly watching some documentary about ocean life, but really just enjoying each other's company in the drowsy afternoon heat. Megan had been curled against Sarah's side, her head on Sarah's shoulder, her fingers tracing absent patterns on Sarah's arm. The documentary had moved on to a segment about seahorses, and the narrator had mentioned that seahorses mate for life, performing elaborate courtship dances before choosing their partners. "That's beautiful," Megan had murmured, her voice soft with sleep. "Imagine knowing exactly who you're meant to be with, having that kind of certainty." Sarah had agreed, hyper-aware of the weight of Megan's head against her shoulder, the way Megan's breath felt against her collarbone. "Do you think that exists? For people, I mean. Soulmates." The question had made Sarah's heart clench. "I don't know. Maybe. I hope it does," Megan had said, and then, so quietly Sarah almost missed it, "I hope I find mine someday." There had been something in her tone, a wistfulness that seemed to suggest she hadn't found that person yet, despite her dating history. Sarah had wanted to ask more, to probe deeper into what Megan meant, but she'd been afraid of what the answer might be. Instead, she'd let her fingers drift through Megan's hair, marveling at its softness, at the way Megan seemed to melt further into her touch. They'd stayed like that for the rest of the afternoon, wrapped in a cocoon of intimacy that felt both completely natural and impossibly significant. That evening, after Megan had gone home, Sarah had found herself analyzing every moment of their interaction, looking for clues she might have missed. The way Megan had looked at her when she'd talked about soulmates, the way she'd seemed reluctant to leave, the lingering hug goodbye that had lasted just a beat longer than usual. Was Sarah imagining things, or was there something more there? The question had consumed her for days, making her second-guess every interaction, every look, every touch. She'd found herself paying closer attention to Megan's dating life, or rather, the apparent absence of one. Megan hadn't mentioned seeing anyone in months, hadn't talked about dating apps or blind dates, or any of the things Sarah would have expected from a single woman in her late 20s. When Sarah had finally worked up the courage to ask about it, Megan's response had been surprisingly revealing. "I don't know," Megan had said, stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. "Dating just feels pointless lately. Like I'm going through the motions because I'm supposed to, not because I actually want to." They'd been sitting in their favorite coffee shop, the one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who always drew little hearts in the foam. It was a Tuesday morning, and the place was mostly empty except for a few other regulars with their laptops and newspapers. "That's how I felt with Steven," Sarah had admitted. "Like I was playing a part in someone else's story." "Exactly," Megan had said, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Like you're following a script someone else wrote for you, but you can't remember agreeing to be in the play." The metaphor had resonated so deeply with Sarah that she'd felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "So, what do you do when you realize you're in the wrong story?" Megan had been quiet for a long moment, staring down at her coffee cup as if it held the answers to all of life's mysteries. When she looked up, there had been something vulnerable in her expression, something that made Sarah's breath catch. "I guess you have to be brave enough to write a new one," Megan had said softly. "Even if you don't know how it ends." The conversation had stayed with Sarah for weeks, replaying in her mind at odd moments. There had been something in Megan's tone, in the way she'd looked at Sarah when she'd said it, that suggested she wasn't just talking about dating in general. But Sarah had been too afraid to push, too scared of reading meaning into words that might have been perfectly innocent. September had brought a subtle shift in their dynamic. The weather had started to cool, which meant more cozy evenings indoors, more opportunities for the kind of intimate conversations that seemed to happen more easily in the soft light of lamps and candles. Megan had started staying later when she came over, finding excuses to linger even when they'd run out of things to watch or do. It was during one of these extended evenings that Sarah had first noticed Megan looking at her differently. They'd been talking about relationships again, a topic that seemed to come up more and more frequently in their conversations. Megan had been describing her last relationship, a 6-month thing with a guy named Frank Ramos who worked in marketing and collected vintage vinyl records. "He was nice," Megan had said, curled up in the corner of Sarah's couch with a glass of wine. "Really nice, actually. The kind of guy who would make someone very happy." But not you, Sarah had observed. But not me, Megan had confirmed. And the worst part was, I couldn't figure out why. On paper, he was perfect. Funny, smart, attractive, stable. We had things in common, we got along well, the physical stuff was. She'd paused, searching for words, fine. But something was missing, you know? Something I couldn't name. Sarah had nodded, understanding completely. Like there was a wall between you and what you were supposed to feel. Yes, Megan had said, and then she looked at Sarah with an intensity that had made Sarah's pulse quicken. You get it. You actually get it. The moment had stretched between them, loaded with unspoken understanding, and Sarah had felt that familiar flutter of possibility in her chest. But then Megan had looked away, taking a sip of her wine, and the moment had passed. Or had it? Sarah had started paying closer attention after that, cataloging moments that might have been meaningful or might have been products of her hopeful imagination. The way Megan's gaze seemed to linger on her face during conversations. How Megan always chose to sit close to her, even when there was plenty of space on the couch. The increasing frequency of casual touches, fingers brushing when they reached for the same thing, hands finding each other during movies, the way Megan seemed to unconsciously lean into Sarah's space. It was driving Sarah slowly insane, this constant wondering, this careful analysis of every interaction. She felt like a detective trying to solve a case with insufficient evidence, looking for patterns that might not exist, reading meaning into gestures that could have been perfectly platonic. The breakthrough had come on a Thursday night in late September. They'd been making dinner together again, something that had become a regular occurrence, when Megan had started talking about her college roommate, a woman named Linda Rivera who had apparently been her closest friend during those years. I was so jealous of her boyfriend, Megan had said, laughing as she told the story. This guy Scott Cox, who was perfectly nice, but completely wrong for her. I used to fantasize about all the ways I could prove to her that she deserved better. That's sweet of you to look out for her like that, Sarah had said, though something in Megan's tone had made her curious. Was it though? Megan had asked, pausing in her chopping to look at Sarah. Or was I just jealous that someone else got to be the most important person in her life? The question had hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah had felt her heart start to race, sensing that they were approaching dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could change everything. I think, Sarah had said carefully, that it's natural to want to protect the people we care about. Even when the person you're protecting them from isn't actually bad for them? Megan had asked. Even when you know your feelings aren't entirely pure? Sarah had set down her own knife, giving Megan her full attention. What do you mean? Megan had been quiet for a long moment, staring down at the vegetables scattered across the cutting board. When she'd spoken, her voice had been barely above a whisper. I think I was in love with her, she'd said. Linda. I think I was in love with her, and I didn't even realize it at the time. I just knew that I wanted to spend all my time with her, that I felt like I could tell her anything, that I was happiest when I was making her laugh. I told myself it was just friendship, but looking back. She'd trailed off, but Sarah had understood. The recognition in Megan's voice, the way she'd described those feelings, it was exactly what Sarah had been experiencing for months. Did you ever tell her? Sarah had asked, though she'd been afraid of the answer. No, Megan had said, and there had been regret in her voice. I was too scared. Too confused about what I was feeling. By the time I figured it out, she was engaged to Scott, and then I graduated and we lost touch. They'd finished preparing dinner in relative silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. But Sarah had felt something shift between them, a door opening that hadn't been there before. Megan had shared something deeply personal, something that suggested she might be more open to the possibility of loving women than Sarah had previously believed. The question was, what was Sarah supposed to do with that information? The answer had come 2 weeks later, on a Friday night that had started like any other, but had ended with everything changed. Megan had come over around 7, as she often did on Friday evenings, carrying a bottle of wine and a bag of takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant. They'd eaten dinner while watching the first half of some romantic movie Megan had chosen, something with beautiful cinematography and a predictably complicated plot about two people who were obviously meant to be together but couldn't see it themselves. God, they're idiots, Megan had said during a particularly frustrating scene where the two leads had just missed each other in a crowded airport. It's so obvious they're in love with each other. Why can't they just say it? Maybe they're scared, Sarah had suggested, acutely aware of the irony. Maybe they think the other person doesn't feel the same way. But they do, Megan had insisted, gesturing at the screen with her wine glass. Anyone can see it. The way they look at each other, the way they light up when they're together. How can they not know? Sarah had felt heat rise in her cheeks, wondering if Megan was talking about the characters on screen or something else entirely. Sometimes people see what they want to see, she'd said carefully. Or they don't see what's right in front of them because they're too afraid to look. Megan had turned to look at her then, something shifting in her expression. Are we still talking about the movie? The question had hit Sarah like a physical blow, direct and unavoidable. She'd felt her heart start to hammer against her ribs, felt the familiar flutter of panic and hope that had become so common whenever their conversations veered into dangerous territory. I don't know, Sarah had whispered, and it had been the most honest thing she'd said in months. Megan had been quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with an intensity that had made Sarah want to look away. But she'd forced herself to maintain eye contact, to let Megan see whatever it was she was looking for. Sarah, Megan had said finally, her voice soft and uncertain. Can I ask you something? Sarah had nodded, not trusting her voice. That night we talked about soulmates, Megan had continued, when I said I hoped I'd find mine someday. Did you think I was talking about some hypothetical future person? The question had stolen Sarah's breath. Weren't you? No, Megan had said, and the single word had rewritten Sarah's entire understanding of their relationship. I wasn't. They'd stared at each other in the flickering light of the television, the movie forgotten, the space between them on the couch suddenly feeling both infinite and non-existent. Sarah had felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that her next words would either send her flying or send her falling. Megan, she'd started, but Megan had held up a hand to stop her. Let me finish, Megan had said. Please. Because if I don't say this now, I might never have the courage again. Sarah had nodded, her heart hammering so hard she was sure Megan could hear it. I've been thinking about what you said, about being brave enough to write a new story, Megan had continued. And I realized that I've been living in someone else's story for so long that I'd forgotten what my own voice sounds like. I've been dating men because that's what I was supposed to do, but none of those relationships ever felt real. They felt like performances, like I was playing the part of someone I thought I should be. She'd paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. But with you, I don't feel like I'm performing. I feel like myself, like the person I actually am instead of the person I think I should be. And I know that might just be friendship, and I know I might be risking everything by saying this, but I think it might be more than that. Sarah had felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the courage it must have taken for Megan to say those words. Megan. I think I'm falling in love with you, Megan had said in a rush, as if she needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. Actually, I think I've been falling in love with you for months, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. The confession had hung between them like a bridge, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to ignore. Sarah had felt like she was drowning and breathing for the first time simultaneously, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Megan had just shared. I'm in love with you too, Sarah had whispered, and saying the words out loud had felt like stepping into sunlight after months in shadow. I have been for so long, Megan. I was so scared you didn't feel the same way. The relief on Megan's face had been immediate and profound, like a weight she'd been carrying had suddenly been lifted. Really? Really, Sarah had confirmed, and then she'd been laughing through her tears, giddy with the impossibility of it all. God, we really are idiots, aren't we? Just like the people in the movie. Speak for yourself, Megan had said, but she'd been laughing too, bright and joyful and free. I prefer romantically challenged. They'd moved toward each other without conscious thought, the space between them on the couch disappearing as if it had never existed. Sarah had found herself close enough to count the flecks of gold in Megan's dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath, close enough to finally close the distance between them. "Can I kiss you?" Megan had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please," Sarah had breathed, and then Megan's lips had been on hers, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as the initial uncertainty melted away. The kiss had been everything Sarah had imagined and nothing like she'd expected, sweet and desperate and perfect in its imperfection. Megan had tasted like wine and possibility, like coming home and setting off on an adventure all at once. Sarah had felt like she was drowning in sensation, in the softness of Megan's lips, the gentle pressure of her hands cupping Sarah's face, the way their bodies seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known was incomplete. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Megan had rested her forehead against Sarah's, her eyes still closed. "Wow," she'd whispered. "Yeah," Sarah had agreed, her voice shaky with emotion. "Wow." They'd stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, sharing the same air, marveling at the magnitude of what had just happened between them. Sarah had felt like her entire world had been reorganized in the space of a single kiss, like everything that had come before had been leading to this moment. "I'm scared," Megan had admitted, her eyes fluttering open to meet Sarah's. "This is all new for me, and I don't want to mess it up." "I'm scared too," Sarah had said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair away from Megan's face. "But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The words had seemed to unlock something in Megan, and she'd kissed Sarah again, deeper this time, with a certainty that hadn't been there before. Sarah had lost herself in it, in the taste and feel and absolute rightness of loving Megan and being loved in return. They'd spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories and fears and dreams they'd never voiced before. Megan had told Sarah about the years she'd spent trying to force herself to feel things she didn't feel, about the guilt and confusion that had accompanied her growing awareness of her attraction to women. Sarah had shared her own journey of discovery, the way her relationship with Stephen had felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit, the months of wondering and hoping and being afraid to hope. "I kept telling myself I was imagining things," Sarah had said, curled up against Megan's side on the couch. "Every time you touched me, every time you looked at me like maybe there was something more there, I convinced myself I was seeing what I wanted to see." "You weren't imagining it," Megan had assured her, pressing a kiss to the top of Sarah's head. "I was just too scared to let myself want what I wanted. It's easier to pretend you don't know something than to face the possibility of rejection." "We wasted so much time," Sarah had said, though she hadn't really meant it as a complaint. Everything had happened exactly as it was supposed to, she realized. They'd needed time to figure themselves out, to be ready for what they were offering each other. "Not wasted," Megan had corrected gently. "We needed that time. I needed to understand what I was feeling before I could share it with you." They'd talked until nearly 3 in the morning, reluctant to let the evening end, to return to a world where they might have to explain or justify what they'd discovered. But eventually exhaustion had won out, and Megan had gathered her things to go back to her own apartment. "This isn't a dream, right?" Megan had asked as she'd stood in Sarah's doorway, her hand on the doorknob. "Tomorrow I'm not going to wake up and discover I imagined this whole thing? If it is a dream, we're both having it," Sarah had said, pulling Megan in for one more kiss. "And I don't want to wake up." That had been 3 months ago, and Sarah still felt like she was living in a dream sometimes. The transition from friendship to romance had been surprisingly natural, as if they'd simply been waiting for permission to be what they'd always been meant to be. They'd moved slowly at first, careful with each other's hearts, learning how to navigate this new dynamic while preserving what had always been precious about their connection. There had been challenges, of course. Coming out to friends and family had been a process, met with varying degrees of surprise and acceptance. Sarah's mother had needed time to adjust, though she'd eventually admitted that she'd never seen Sarah as happy as she was with Megan. Megan's parents had been more immediately supportive, though they'd confessed they'd suspected something was developing between the two women long before either of them had figured it out themselves. "We could see it in the way you talked about each other," Megan's mother had said during their first dinner together as a couple. "The way your faces lit up when you said her name." There had been practical considerations too. They'd decided to keep their separate apartments for now, wanting to take things slowly, but they'd been spending most nights together anyway. Sarah's place had become their default gathering spot, partly because it was slightly larger and partly because it felt like neutral territory, a space they'd been sharing long before their relationship had changed. It was during one of those nights, about a month into their official relationship, that the conversation about sleeping arrangements had first come up. They'd been lying in Sarah's bed, talking quietly in the darkness, when Megan had mentioned something about her sleepwear preferences. "I should probably warn you," Megan had said, her voice soft in the darkness. "I don't really do pajamas." "I hope that's okay." Sarah had felt her pulse quicken at the implication. They'd been taking things slowly physically, content to explore this new dimension of their relationship without rushing toward milestones. But the thought of Megan sleeping beside her with less clothing than she'd been wearing had sent heat shooting through Sarah's entire body. "What do you usually wear?" Sarah had asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Nothing, usually."